The trauma pager screamed before I could finish charting my last patient. Pamela, incoming rollover accident. Another nurse shouted. I'm on my way. I shoved my phone into my scrub pocket and sprinted toward trauma room 2. Halfway down the hallway, it vibrated. Ethan. I smiled despite the chaos. He'd promised to text me the moment he got to my parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner. Made it, Mom. Grandma says dinner's almost ready. Love you. Relief washed over me. I typed back, love you too. Be good. Save me some pie. The automatic doors burst open as paramedics rolled in a bleeding patient. For the next 20 minutes, Thanksgiving disappeared behind chest compressions, for lines, and shouted vital signs. Then my phone buzzed again. When I finally looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. Mom, they said there wasn't a seat for me. I stared at the message, convinced I had misunderstood it. Another text arrived. Grandpa said the table was already full. Uncle Scott laughed and said maybe next year. Grandma just kept looking at her plate. I could almost hear my 15-year-old son trying not to cry through those words. Then one final message appeared. I'm going home. I couldn't leave. I couldn't even call. A doctor was asking for medication, a respiratory therapist was waiting for orders, and the patient on the table was fighting for every breath. At that moment, I was saving a stranger's life while my own son was walking away from the only family Thanksgiving he had left. And my parents knew I couldn't come. That was exactly why they'd chosen tonight. For 12 years after my husband died, emergency medicine had become both my purpose and my prison. Hospitals didn't close for holidays. Illness didn't care about Thanksgiving. Every year someone had to miss dinner, and this year it was my turn again. When my schedule came out weeks earlier, my mother had insisted everything would be fine. Leave Ethan with us, she'd said warmly over the phone. He's family. We'll take good care of him. Ethan had even sounded excited. He helped bake pumpkin bread the night before. He packed the apple pie we'd made together because Grandma always claimed his crust was the best. He'd walked into that house believing he belonged there. While another trauma patient was taken for surgery, I finally stole 60 seconds inside the staff lounge. I opened the family security app connected to our front door. The timestamp showed Ethan arriving home far earlier than expected. He unlocked the door alone. No one followed him. No one came after him. I watched him set the untouched pie on the kitchen counter before opening the pantry. Instead of a Thanksgiving meal, he heated a single can of chicken noodle soup. He carried the bowl to our small dining table, sat by himself, and quietly ate while scrolling through his phone. The empty chair across from him looked bigger than the room itself. I pressed my hand against my mouth. Not because he was eating soup. Because somewhere across town, my parents and my brother were still sitting around a table that had somehow found room for everyone except my son. My phone rang. For one hopeful second, I thought it might be my mother. It wasn't. Another nurse was asking where I was needed. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked toward the emergency department again. As I reached my locker, my eyes settled on a thick manila envelope resting beneath a blue file folder. I'd placed it there 3 days earlier. It had been meant to wait until after Thanksgiving. Slowly, I picked it up. I looked at the name written across the front. Harold Carter. I closed my locker, held the envelope against my chest, and whispered just 4 quiet words. Then tomorrow it is. What my parents didn't know was that Thanksgiving wasn't the only thing waiting for them the next morning. The sky was turning pale by the time I unlocked my front door. I'd been awake for nearly 24 hours. My feet ached. My head pounded, and every instinct told me to collapse into bed. Instead, I found Ethan standing at the kitchen sink. He was washing a single soup bowl that was already clean. He scrubbed it anyway. You don't have to do that, I said quietly. He shrugged without turning around. I know. He rinsed the bowl one more time before placing it carefully on the drying rack. Only then did he face me. He smiled. It was the kind of smile children wear when they're trying to make life easier for their parents. How was work? I stared at him. My shift doesn't matter. It does. No, I said softly. Not today. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house felt strangely silent without the sounds of a Thanksgiving dinner that should have happened. I stepped closer. What happened? Ethan looked down at the kitchen floor. I got there early like Grandma asked. He folded his arms tightly across his chest. Everyone was already there. Uncle Scott's kids were setting the table. He paused. I asked Grandma where you wanted me to sit. His voice caught. She didn't answer. I felt my chest tighten. Grandpa looked at the table and said, Ethan swallowed. He said there wasn't another chair. I clenched my jaw. He actually said there wasn't a seat. Ethan nodded. I thought maybe they were joking. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. So I laughed. That hurt more than anything else. He'd wanted so badly to believe it was a joke. Then Uncle Scott said. Ethan hesitated before forcing the words out. Maybe next year we'll remember to count you. The room became impossibly still. And everybody laughed. Not everybody. He shook his head. Grandma didn't. What did she do? She kept putting mashed potatoes on people's plates. He looked up at me for the first time. She never looked at me. I wrapped him in my arms. At 15, he was nearly taller than I was, but in that moment, he felt like the little boy who used to hide behind my legs on the first day of school. I'm sorry, I whispered. You don't have to be. I do. They're your family. The sentence landed like a punch. Not because he blamed me. Because he didn't. He was trying to protect me from the truth. After a long silence, he pulled away. It isn't the first time. I frowned. What do you mean? He walked over to the living room bookshelf and picked up an old framed Christmas photo. Scott's family stood in the center. My parents stood beside them. Ethan and I were squeezed onto the very edge. I started noticing things a while ago. He gave a sad smile. When Uncle Scott's kids had birthdays, Grandma made huge parties. He counted quietly on his fingers. My birthdays were always after everyone had already gone home. He looked at another family picture. They bought Jacob a laptop when he turned 14. I remember. They gave me a sweatshirt. I closed my eyes. I remembered telling myself none of those things mattered. That gifts weren't important. That keeping peace was more valuable than starting arguments. Now I realized what my silence had cost my son. There were always reasons, I murmured. I know. They forgot your birthday dinner once. They said work got in the way. They skipped your soccer championship. They were tired. They cropped you out of one family picture. The photographer made a mistake. Every excuse I'd accepted sounded ridiculous now. Ethan looked at me gently. I thought maybe I just wasn't important enough. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. No. He blinked. I honestly believed they forgot to save me a chair. His voice broke. But when Uncle Scott laughed, he looked away. I knew they hadn't forgotten. They wanted me to leave. Something inside me settled. Not exploded. Settled. For years, I'd convinced myself endurance was kindness. That swallowing insults made me the bigger person. Standing in my own kitchen, looking at the clean bowl my son had eaten Thanksgiving dinner from alone, I understood I'd mistaken silence for strength. I walked into my bedroom and picked up my phone. My attorney answered on the second ring. Good morning, Pamela. Is everything still scheduled? Yes. No delays. None. I glanced toward the kitchen where Ethan was quietly putting the soup can into the recycling bin. They're expecting one outcome, my attorney said evenly. They'll receive another. I thanked him and ended the call. When I returned, Ethan looked at me uncertainly. What happens now? I rested both hands on his shoulders. You never have to wonder whether you belong again. He searched my face. What do you mean? I picked up the manila envelope from my purse and held it for a moment before setting it back down. You'll understand tomorrow. Just then my phone chimed. It was a text from my attorney. Meet me at Grandma's house at 10 o'clock. Bring the envelope. At exactly 10 o'clock Friday morning, I pulled into my grandmother's driveway with Ethan beside me. The annual post-Thanksgiving family estate meeting had been held at this house for as long as I could remember. After Grandma's passing, the tradition continued. Everyone gathered to discuss maintenance on the family properties, holiday schedules, and the investments that had remained in the estate. Most of the relatives believed my father was simply carrying out Grandma's wishes. Only a handful knew there had been legal reviews underway for months. Ethan looked over at me. You sure you want me in there? Yes. They're going to be angry. They already made their choice yesterday. I picked up the sealed manila envelope from the passenger seat. Today, they live with it. Inside, the dining room looked almost identical to the night before. Only this time, every chair was occupied. Every seat had a name card. Every relative greeted us politely. Several people smiled at Ethan. My Aunt Linda walked over immediately. "There you are," she said, giving Ethan a quick hug. "We missed you at dinner yesterday. Harold said you had to leave early." Ethan glanced at me. I gave him a small nod. He answered honestly, "I didn't have other plans." The room grew quieter. I was told there wasn't a seat for me. The sentence landed with a weight no one expected. Aunt Linda frowned. "What do you mean?" I asked Grandma where I should sit. He kept his voice calm. Grandpa said the table was already full. He looked toward Harold. Uncle Scott joked maybe next year they'd remember to count me. No one interrupted him. No one asked me to stay. I left. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. One cousin slowly lowered her coffee cup. An uncle stared directly at my father. Across the room, my mother kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. Scott broke the silence first. "Oh, come on." He laughed dismissively. "He's 15. He took a joke too seriously." Nobody laughed with him. Aunt Linda looked at Scott. "A joke?" Scott shrugged. "There wasn't enough room." "There were folding chairs in the garage," another cousin said quietly. Scott's smile faded. My father cleared his throat. "Let's stay focused on the estate meeting." I finally spoke. "No." Every head turned toward me. "We're going to stay focused on the truth." Without raising my voice, I walked to the head of the table. I placed the sealed manila envelope directly in front of my father. "I believe these belong to you." He glanced at the envelope. His expression relaxed. "I was wondering when these would arrive." He sounded almost pleased. Several relatives assumed it was routine legal paperwork connected to the estate. Scott leaned back confidently. "See," he said, "business first." My father opened the envelope. He removed the first document. "Read one line." Then another. The color drained from his face. His confident smile disappeared. "What?" His voice barely came out. Scott reached across the table. "Let me see." He grabbed the papers. His eyes raced from page to page. The smug expression he'd worn all morning dissolved into disbelief. He flipped to the next document. Then another. His breathing became noticeably faster. "This." He looked at me. "And what is this?" I met his eyes calmly. The documents explained themselves. Around the table, relatives leaned forward, sensing this was far more than ordinary estate paperwork. Scott turned another page. His hands began to shake. He looked at my father. Neither of them spoke. For the first time in years, neither man seemed to know what to say. Then my father shot to his feet so abruptly that his chair crashed backward onto the hardwood floor. "This can't be legal." My father's voice echoed through the dining room. "This can't be legal." No one moved. The only sound was his overturned chair rocking once before falling still. Scott slammed the papers onto the table. "She set us up." "No," I replied evenly. "I followed Grandma's instructions. You've been planning this behind our backs." Before I could answer, the front door opened. Everyone turned. My attorney stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase. He had been invited for exactly this moment. "Good morning," he said calmly. "I'm sorry to interrupt." My father pointed a trembling finger toward him. "You." The attorney nodded politely. "Mr. Carter." He walked to the table, placed his briefcase down, and removed several neatly organized folders. "I believe everyone deserves a clear explanation." No one spoke as he distributed copies to the relatives seated around the table. My father refused to touch his. Scott snatched his copy and began flipping through it. "This is ridiculous," Scott muttered. "It isn't," the attorney replied. "Everything contained here has already been reviewed and approved." He looked around the room. Several years before Mrs. Eleanor Carter passed away, she became concerned about the management of her remaining estate. A murmur spread around the table. My Aunt Linda frowned. "Concerned about what?" The attorney opened one of the folders. She noticed repeated financial decisions that benefited only certain members of the family. Scott interrupted immediately. That's a lie. The attorney didn't even look at him. It is documented. He slid several financial summaries across the table. Mrs. Carter requested an independent review before making amendments to her estate. My father crossed his arms. She trusted me. She did, the attorney answered. Until the records stopped matching. He calmly pointed to the first document. Over several years, funds intended for maintenance of family property were redirected. Another page. Trust distributions exceeded authorized limits. Another. Estate accounts paid for expenses unrelated to estate business. Every page contained dates, bank records, receipts, authorizations. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. The kind facts couldn't argue with. Across the table, one of my cousins slowly whispered, "I remember when Grandma said repairs kept getting delayed." Another relative added, "And she kept asking where the money had gone." Pieces that had never made sense were suddenly fitting together. Scott shoved the papers away. "This is private family business." "No," Aunt Linda said quietly. "It became everyone's business the moment family money was abused." Scott stared at her in disbelief. "You too?" She didn't answer. My father finally turned toward me. "So that's what this is." His voice hardened. "Revenge? For Thanksgiving?" I shook my head. "No. You embarrassed us because Ethan got his feelings hurt." I folded my hands calmly in front of me. "The audit began months ago." He blinked. "What?" "This process started long before Thanksgiving." I looked around the room. I intended to wait until after the holiday before delivering the documents. Scott frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't want legal business to ruin Thanksgiving." Silence. Yesterday changed one thing. Everyone watched me. I realized I wasn't protecting this family by waiting. I looked directly at my father. I was protecting the people hurting my son. The room felt different now. Not louder. Heavier. Relatives who had remained silent for years were no longer looking at me. They were looking at my father. Questions began coming from every direction. "You never mentioned an audit. Why didn't anyone know about these amendments? When did Grandma sign these papers?" Scott tried to interrupt each question before it finished. My father answered none of them. For the first time anyone could remember, he no longer controlled the room. He simply sat there. Quiet. The authority he'd carried for decades was slipping away one unanswered question at a time. Then he slowly lifted his head and looked directly at me. "You're really doing this?" He swallowed hard. "To your own parents?" I held his gaze without anger. "No." My voice was steady. "You did this yourselves." No one argued. No one defended him. The silence itself had become the answer. Just as my father lowered his eyes, my attorney reached into his briefcase one last time. He removed a single document that had not yet been shared. "There is," he said, placing it carefully on the table. "One final page that everyone here needs to read." Every eye in the room shifted toward it. My attorney waited until the room was completely silent before sliding the final document to the center of the table. "This," he said, "is the final amendment to Elena Carter's estate plan." My father reached for it first. His hand shook so badly that he nearly dropped the page. Scott leaned over his shoulder. As they read, neither of them spoke. Then my attorney addressed the room. Mrs. Elena Carter appointed Pamela Carter as the sole executor and trustee of her remaining estate. A collective gasp spread around the dining room. He continued before anyone could interrupt. The appointment became legally effective several weeks ago after the independent audit was completed and the court accepted the findings. He opened another folder. Mr. Harold Carter and Mr. Scott Carter have been permanently removed from all authority regarding estate properties, investments, and future distributions. Scott looked up so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. "No." He turned toward me. "You can't just take everything." "I didn't," I answered quietly. "Grandma decided that." My father finally found his voice. "She would have never done this." The attorney calmly lifted another document. "She wrote a personal letter to accompany the amendment." He unfolded the page. "With the family's permission, I'll read only the relevant portion." No one objected. He began. "If you are hearing this, then the audit confirmed what I feared. Family should never be used as an excuse to excuse dishonesty. The person I trust to protect what remains is Pamela, because she has consistently chosen responsibility over entitlement. The attorney lowered the letter. Those were Mrs. Carter's own words. My father's shoulders sagged. For the first time in my life, he looked smaller than the room around him. My mother quietly covered her face with both hands. Tears slipped through her fingers. I knew. She whispered. No one answered. She slowly looked at me. I knew things weren't fair. Her voice trembled. I told myself keeping the peace was better than fighting. She glanced toward Ethan. I'm sorry. It was the first apology she'd ever offered him. Ethan nodded politely. Thank you. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He simply accepted the words without pretending they erased what had happened. Scott suddenly pushed his chair back. Ethan. My son turned toward him. I was wrong. Scott swallowed. I shouldn't have said what I said yesterday. I shouldn't have laughed. The room waited. Ethan answered with the same calmness he'd shown all morning. You only found a seat for me after you lost yours. No one spoke. Scott's face fell. There was nothing left to say. Over the next several weeks, the legal transition happened exactly as the documents required. Independent financial professionals assumed management of the estate. Every account was transferred. Every property record was updated. Every future distribution followed the instructions my grandmother had written years earlier. No exceptions. Several relatives called me privately. Some admitted they'd noticed favoritism for years, but never wanted to challenge my father. Others apologized for staying silent. One by one, family gatherings changed. They were no longer organized around my father's decisions. For the first time, everyone had a voice. My father and Scott still attended some events during the first few months, but without control of the estate or the unquestioned authority they'd enjoyed for decades, they found themselves isolated by the consequences of their own actions. No one needed to force them out. People simply stopped pretending nothing had happened. As for me, I made a different decision. I ended contact with anyone who believed protecting appearances mattered more than protecting my son. It wasn't easy, but it was peaceful. A year later, Thanksgiving looked nothing like it had before. I wasn't working that holiday. Our home wasn't large. The dining table didn't match. The chairs were borrowed from neighbors. None of it mattered. A few nurses from the emergency department came after finishing their shifts. The elderly man who lived across the street brought homemade rolls. My Aunt Linda arrived carrying sweet potato casserole. A couple of cousins came with their children. The house filled with laughter instead of tension. As everyone gathered around the table, Ethan noticed one empty chair. He smiled. Mom. I looked up from setting down the turkey. Yeah. Why is there an extra place? I rested my hand on the back of the chair. Because if someone ever shows up needing family. I smiled at him. They'll never have to wonder if there's room. He smiled back. The meal began. Conversations overlapped. Plates were passed. People laughed over stories from work and school. No one counted chairs. No one decided who belonged. As I looked around that table, I finally understood what my grandmother had protected. The estate had never been the real inheritance. It was the chance to build a family where love was never measured by favoritism, silence, or power. And I knew with absolute certainty that my son would never again believe there wasn't a place for him at the table.